The silence that fell over the grand chamber of the Mordaine court was the kind that preceded executions. Vera Hawthorne stood at the center of the obsidian floor, her plain grey maid's uniform a stark wound against the midnight splendor surrounding her. 7 vampire elders occupied their thrones in a semicircle before her, each one ancient beyond reckoning, each one regarding her with the particular brand of contempt reserved for insects found in wineglasses. The chamber itself was carved from black granite beneath the city of Vienna, deeper than any subway tunnel, older than the Republic itself, lit by chandeliers of cold silver flame that cast no warmth whatsoever. She had been summoned here to be erased. That was the polite term the court used. Not killed, not silenced. Erased as though a human woman who had witnessed too much, who had survived too long within the walls of a vampire estate, could simply be rubbed out like a pencil mark on parchment. The elder, called Vasilius, rose first. He was the oldest of them, white-haired and white-skinned as they all were. His face a carved mask of aristocratic contempt beneath cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. His robes were deep burgundy, ancient silk, and his eyes were the color of old amber held to a dying flame. "The human maid," he said, and his voice contained the rumble of centuries, "has been found in possession of the Mordaine codex. She has read passages no living human was ever intended to see. Under the ancient vow of court secrecy, the blood law is clear. She must be erased before the next moonrise." 6 heads nodded with the slow, deliberate certainty of creatures who had never once in their immortal lives been told no. Vera did not flinch. She held the leather-bound codex against her chest with both hands, and she looked directly at Vasilius with eyes that were entirely, stubbornly, furiously human. "Before you do that," she said, her voice ringing out across the obsidian floor with a clarity that surprised even her, "you should know that I have already transmitted the entirety of the codex to 3 separate secure servers, and the access credentials are locked to my heartbeat." The silence changed quality. It became something different, something that held the suggestion of danger redirected. "If my heart stops," Vera continued, keeping her voice absolutely level, "the codex goes public. Every blood law, every ancient vow, every name in this court, every deal you have made with human governments for the last 400 years, all of it, to every journalist, every intelligence agency, every academic institution with the infrastructure to receive a 40-gigabyte encrypted file, which is, in this century, quite a few." Vasilius took 1 step forward. His amber eyes had gone very dark. And then the doors at the far end of the chamber burst open. Emeric Mordaine walked through them, like a storm given human shape. He was taller than any of the elders, broader through the shoulders, and the white hair that fell to his jaw was the only soft thing about him. His face was all sharp planes and cold beauty, the kind of face that had been called dangerous for 300 years, and had never once disagreed with the assessment. His coat was black, his eyes were silver, and the look he turned on Vasilius could have stripped paint from stone walls. "Touch her," he said quietly, "and discover exactly what the price of that is." The room did not breathe. Rooms containing vampires often held their metaphorical breath during moments of political violence, but this was different. This was the head of House Mordaine addressing the Elder Council in his own court, and the weight of that was considerable. Vera turned to look at him. Something complicated moved through her chest at the sight of him, something she had spent 3 months carefully not naming, and she pressed it down now because this was not the moment. Vasilius spread his long hands. "Lord Mordaine, this is a blood law matter. The codex was compromised. The law requires erasure." "The law," Emeric said, crossing the floor toward Vera without looking away from Vasilius, "was written to protect the court from hostile intelligence operations. Not to murder a woman who has served this household with integrity and who found the codex because your own archivist left it unsecured in a common cleaning corridor." He reached Vera's side and stood there, not in front of her, not shielding her from view, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder. A statement that left no room for misinterpretation. "The fault belongs to the court. The response will not be to destroy an innocent person." "She is human," said Elder Seraphon from the second throne. Seraphon was female, older even than Vasilius, with white hair coiled like ropes of frost around her ancient head and eyes of pale, pale violet that had seen the fall of 3 empires. Human maidservants do not threaten the Elder Council with leverage. Human maidservants do not possess the intelligence or the nerve required to. And yet here I am, Vera said. Seraphon stopped speaking. The silence this time was different from all the previous silences. It had a texture to it, something crystalline and brittle, the kind of silence that comes just before a very old thing admits that the world has changed around it without its permission. Vera looked at each elder in turn. 7 ancient faces. 7 pairs of eyes ranging from amber to violet to the deep garnet red of one called Mortivar, who had not yet spoken, but whose expression had shifted from contempt to something that might, in the right light, be called interest. I am not threatening you, Vera said carefully. I am offering you a transaction. The same kind of transaction this court has been conducting with the human world for centuries. I have something you want, which is the guarantee of your secrecy. You have something I want. And what? Said Emeric, very quietly and very carefully, as though he was hearing this part for the first time. Is it that you want? She turned to look at him. 3 months of working in his household. 3 months of cleaning the silver frames of portraits she was not supposed to study, of carrying correspondence she was not supposed to read, of watching him move through rooms she was not supposed to enter, and yet somehow always found herself in, because the household was vast and her assignments were broad, and Emeric Mordaine had a habit of appearing in doorways and asking her quiet questions about things that had nothing to do with cleaning schedules. I want the court to formally acknowledge that Vera Hawthorne's death was not a suicide. The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. Ripples moved outward from it. She watched them register on the faces of the elders. Subtle as whispers, but present, they knew the name. She had suspected they would, and the confirmation of it was both vindicating and devastating simultaneously. My sister, Vera said, worked for this court for 2 years before she died. Official record says she took her own life in the employees' quarter of the East Wing. I know she did not. I came here to find proof. I found the codex instead, and within it, a set of entries in the administrative ledger dated to the week of Marin's death that reference an erasure order signed by 4 members of this council. The elder Mortivar spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than the others, and strangely gentle, which somehow made it worse. You came here as a spy. I came here as a sister, Vera said. The spy part I improvised. Emeric made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was controlled too quickly, but she heard it. And something in her chest responded to it, despite every instruction she had given that part of herself. Vasilius turned slowly to regard the other elders. A look passed between several of them. The kind of communication that took place in the space between words, the language of immortals who had been reading each other's expressions for centuries. Then he turned back. The Hawthorne girl discovered something she was not meant to discover, he said. The erasure was lawful under blood law. She had witnessed a feeding that was itself a violation of the non-disclosure accords, conducted by a court member who has since been removed. It was, from the court's perspective, a tragedy of circumstance. From my perspective, Vera said, it was murder. Yes, said Mortivar, and there was something in his old garnet eyes that looked, against all probability, like the beginning of remorse. It was. The admission hung in the air. Even Seraphon seemed briefly startled by it. Vasilius drew himself up with the dignity of a creature who had not admitted fault since the 16th century, and was not about to start now. But Mortivar held Vera's gaze and did not look away. The court member who ordered it, Vera said, is no longer a member of this court. He was removed 18 months ago, Emeric said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that told her this was not news to him, that he had known part of this, perhaps not the full shape of it, but enough, and that he had carried it. He violated 7 blood laws over a period of decades. His removal was permanent. Vera absorbed this. She had imagined, in the 3 months since she had gotten herself hired, through an agency that specialized in placing domestic staff for high-end private clients, that she would feel rage at this moment. She had imagined herself cold and certain. Instead, she felt the enormous, exhausting weight of grief, the specific grief of a mystery solved in the worst possible way, when the answer is exactly what you feared and does nothing to bring anyone back. She breathed through it. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of 7 vampire elders. I want a formal written acknowledgement, she said, when she was sure her voice would hold. I want the administrative entries corrected. I want Marin's name cleared. And I want your guarantee that no action will be taken against me or anyone I care about, permanently and irrevocably. Vasilius looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Emeric. Emeric looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has drawn a line and is daring anyone in the room to step over it. She is owed this, Emeric said. Her sister served this court. She came here at genuine risk to herself. She has handled information that could destroy us with more restraint and more strategic intelligence than most of our own operatives would have shown. You will give her what she asks. The elder council of the Mordaine court had not been addressed in that tone since Emeric's own succession, which had involved a degree of political drama that the court historians still referenced with a kind of exhausted respect. Several of them looked at each other again. Several exchanged those silent elder communications in the space of seconds. It was Seraphon who finally said, with the precise enunciation of someone pronouncing a judgment they find technically correct but personally objectionable, the court acknowledges the Hawthorne matter. The acknowledgement will be formalized. The blood law erasure order for the current Hawthorne will be rescinded. Lord Mordaine will serve as guarantor of her safety within court jurisdiction. And outside it, Emeric said. A pause. And outside it, Seraphon agreed. Vera let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 months, perhaps longer. Perhaps in some way for the 2 years since Marin had called her on a Tuesday evening, sounding strange and distracted and unlike herself, and Vera had told her she would call back in the morning. And in the morning, the call had been from a different voice entirely, telling her that her sister was gone. The formal acknowledgement was drawn up in the chamber itself, on ancient parchment in the court's traditional ink. It was signed by all 7 elders. It was witnessed by Emeric. A copy was sealed in the court records. A copy was handed to Vera. She held it in both hands and thought about Marin, who had been 24 years old and fearless, and who had laughed too loudly at bad jokes, and had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring Vera soup when she was sick. She thought about what she wished she could say to her. She thought about the fact that clarity, even without justice, was a form of gift, and that she would have to learn to accept it. Then the chamber emptied in the slow, deliberate way of ancient creatures who considered haste beneath their dignity, and she was left standing on the obsidian floor with Emeric Mordaine, and the silence between them was entirely different from all the silences that had preceded it. He had not moved from her side. You did something very dangerous tonight, he said. I know, you could have been killed before I arrived, if I had been 20 minutes later. I had the leverage, Vera. He said her name the way he had been saying it for 3 months, with a particular weight on the first syllable. Not impatient, not dismissive, but with the quality of someone who had been paying very careful attention to someone they were not supposed to be paying attention to. You were gambling your life on the assumption that Vasilius would not call your threat, dismantle the servers faster than the dead man switch could execute, and erase you before sunrise. It was not an assumption, she said. I had run the probabilities very carefully. Their response window was too narrow. Even with vampire speed, the decryption architecture alone would have taken Vera. What? He turned to look at her fully then, and she looked back at him. And the thing she had spent 3 months carefully not naming was suddenly very difficult to keep unnamed. He was 340 years old. She knew this because she had read his entry in the codex, among other things. He had been turned at 26 in the winter of 1683, in a city that no longer existed by the name it had then. He looked, as vampires always did, like the best possible version of the age at which they had been turned, which in his case was devastating, because 26 rendered in the specific aristocratic architecture of his face, combined with 3 centuries of absolute confidence and the kind of physical presence that made entire rooms reorient themselves around him, was a great deal to contend with. She was 28, entirely human. She wore a grey maid's uniform, and her dark hair had come half out of its pin during the address to the Elder Council, and she was holding a piece of parchment that represented the closest thing to justice she was going to get for her sister. Thank you, she said, for coming, for standing beside me. Where else would I be, he said, and the simplicity of it was so complete that she did not have an answer for it. She had worked in his household for 3 months, and in the first 3 weeks she had told herself that she was there for Marin, which was true. She had told herself that the quiet conversations in the late evenings when he found her polishing the silver were purely incidental, which was not true, and she had known. It was not true from approximately the 5th conversation, when he had sat down on the other side of the table and asked her what she thought about the nature of obligation between immortals and mortals, and she had told him with complete directness what she thought, and he had listened as though her answer was the most interesting thing he had heard in decades. "You knew," she said. "Did you know why I was really here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not at the beginning. By the 2nd month, I had begun to suspect. The questions you asked were too precise. You knew too much about the layout of the restricted archives for someone who had never been hired at that level. Why did you not report me?" "Because," he said, "I wanted to know what you were looking for, and because I had read your sister's file." He paused. "She should not have died. What was done to her was a violation of everything this court claims to value. I could not undo it, but I could allow you the space to find your answers." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "You were protecting me even then." "Yes. Without my knowledge, you would not have accepted it with your knowledge." That was accurate. She was silent, turning it over. Outside the chamber, somewhere in the vast underground corridors of the Mordaine estate beneath Vienna, she could hear the distant movement of court staff, the soft sound of the ancient place returning to its usual rhythms. "What happens now?" she asked. "With me, with my employment. I assume the Maid cover is thoroughly expired." The ghost of something moved through his expression. "The court has guaranteed your safety. Your contract is whatever you choose it to be." He paused, and she saw something she had not expected on his face. Something carefully controlled but present, a kind of uncertainty that looked genuinely unfamiliar to him. There are roles within the estate that are not domestic in nature. Research positions. "I require someone with archival expertise to audit the administrative records of the past 40 years. It would be detailed work. It would require someone with very good instincts for reading between lines." "You are offering me a job," she said slowly. "I am offering you a reason to stay," he said, "if you want one." The room was very quiet. The silver flames in the chandeliers burned without flickering, without warmth, and Vera Hawthorne stood in the most dangerous place she had ever been in her life, and felt, against all reasonable expectation, something that was the opposite of afraid. "I want one," she said. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most clarifying of her life. The Mordaine estate was not only the underground chamber and the grand formal rooms that existed for elder councils and blood law proceedings. It was also, she discovered, a labyrinthine complex of libraries and workrooms and living quarters, and a kitchen that operated on a 24-hour schedule to accommodate the various human staff who remained. There were, she realized, quite a few humans employed within the estate, and they fell broadly into 2 categories. There were those who had been there long enough to have made peace with their situation, and had constructed comfortable, well-compensated lives within it. And there were those who were terrified all of the time and counting the days until their contract ended. Vera did not belong to either category. She was something the household did not quite have a template for, which was a human who had successfully addressed the Elder Council and walked out of the encounter with a signed document, and who now worked directly for Lord Mordaine in a capacity that gave her access to rooms that most of the estate's own vampire staff were not cleared for. Emeric gave her the East Wing archive and told her to find everything that was wrong with it. She found 17 things in the first week and put them in a report that she left on his desk with precisely organized tabs and a color-coded summary page. He read it overnight and came to find her the following evening as she was cross-referencing a ledger against a series of older entries. 12 of these I knew about, he said, setting the report on the table beside her. 3 of them I suspected. 2 of them are entirely new information. Where did you find the Seraphon correspondence? It was misfiled in the 1990s records, she said, without looking up from the ledger. Someone pulled it from its original binding and put it in a protective sleeve, and then put the sleeve inside a false bottom in one of the storage boxes. It was very good work, actually. I only found it because the weight distribution of the box was slightly off. You weighed the boxes. I weigh everything. A habit. She felt him looking at her, and she finished the annotation she was making before looking up. He was leaning against this archive shelving, with his arms folded and his silver eyes on her, and he looked simultaneously like someone who had just been given an unexpected gift, and someone who had absolutely no intention of showing it. The Seraphon correspondence is significant, he said. It references an agreement made in 1987 that predates my succession. If what you found is what I believe it is, it changes several standing assumptions about how this court's authority was transferred. I know, she said. I read it. Of course you did. You told me to find everything that was wrong with the archive. I cannot tell you what is wrong with a document without reading it. Vera. He said her name again with that weight. What does the correspondence contain? She closed the ledger and turned to face him directly. It contains evidence that Elder Vasilius transferred a significant portion of authority over the court's financial structures to Seraphon in exchange for her support during your succession. Authority that should have been transferred to you. Your control over the court's external assets is approximately 30% smaller than you believe it to be. The silence that followed was not like any of the silences in the Elder Chamber. It was quieter, more personal. That, he said, after a moment, is not a small thing. No, she agreed, it is not. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he pushed off from the shelving and pulled the chair across from her out and sat down in it, which was unexpected. And he looked at her across the table with an expression that was stripped of its usual controlled certainty. Not much, just at the edges, but enough. Tell me what else you found, he said. She told him. She had organized it by severity and by type: financial irregularities, unauthorized transfers of court jurisdiction, records of external dealings that had been conducted in the court's name without full elder consensus, and 3 instances in the more recent records of what appeared to be deliberate obscuring of the circumstances around staff departures. One of those instances had an entry date that put it within 6 months of Maron's death, and it referenced a different member of staff entirely, which meant the problem had been larger than a single rogue court member. Emeric listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He asked precise questions and absorbed the answers. And when she finished, he looked at her for a long time with something in his silver eyes that had moved past surprise and into something more settled, something more serious. When I offered you this position, he said, I thought I was giving you work that would use your intelligence and keep you close to the estate where the court's guarantee of your protection would be most functional. That is a very careful way of saying you wanted to keep an eye on me, she said. It is, but what you have actually done is hand me the means to restructure this court's power in a way that has needed to happen for 30 years. He paused. I am not sure you understood how significant what you just handed me is. I understood exactly how significant it is, she said. That is why I gave it to you. You are the only person in this court I trust to use it correctly. The look on his face at that was one of the most unguarded things she had ever seen him show, and she had been watching him carefully for nearly 4 months now. Something moved behind his eyes, deep and genuine and complicated, and he looked at her with a directness that felt like the first moment of a conversation that had been building for a very long time. You trust me, he said. You came through those doors, she said simply. When Vasilius was standing in front of me with that expression that elder vampires use when they have already decided on an outcome and are simply completing the formality of the process, you came through those doors and you stood next to me. You did not stand in front of me like I needed protecting. You stood next to me like I was the one doing the protecting and you were backing my play. You were the one doing the protecting, he said. The dead man's switch was brilliant. I would not have thought of it. You are 300 years old and you did not grow up with the internet. I grew up with poison and political assassination, which is functionally similar, she laughed. It came out before she could manage it, bright and genuine, and it bounced off the ancient archive walls and the shelves of leather-bound records, and it sounded completely out of place and entirely right. He smiled. She had not seen him smile before, not like this. Not with both sides of his face and the silver of his eyes changing quality. It transformed him in a way that she had not been prepared for. Vera, he said, and this time her name had something new in it. not the weight of careful attention. Something warmer than that. Something that moved through the room between them, like the first note of a piece of music she had heard before but could not quite place. What I said to you that first evening in the Elder Chamber, about the reason I allowed you space to find your answers. That was true, but it was not the whole of it. She waited. I also, he paused, and she saw the unfamiliarity on his face again, the genuine unease of someone navigating territory they had not mapped. I did not want you to leave. From the first week, before I knew why you were here, before I suspected anything. You asked me a question on your fourth evening in the household. Do you remember? About the portrait in the south corridor. She remembered. She had asked him who the woman in the portrait was, the human woman in the painting that was at least 2 centuries old, who stood in a garden that no longer existed and looked out of the canvas with an expression of absolute self-possession that Vera had found magnetic. You told me she was a friend, Vera said. A human who had lived in the household in the early 19th century. She was more than a friend, he said. She was the first person who made me understand that mortal lives are not lesser for being brief, that the brevity of a thing has nothing to do with its weight. He looked at the portrait of her that he kept in his mind, the way she moved through rooms, the way she thought, the way she had stood before 7 ancient and deadly creatures, and held her ground with nothing but intelligence and nerve and the right kind of preparation. She died, eventually, as mortals do. And for a long time after, I believed that the lesson of her was that love between an immortal and a mortal was a particular form of cruelty, that no matter the weight of the connection, the arithmetic of it was always the same. One person stays and one person goes. Vera was very still. When you asked me about the portrait, he said, I looked at you and I thought, here is someone who would understand exactly what that woman understood, and I did not want to send you away, even then. Even when I still thought you might simply be an unusually intelligent maid. I was an unusually intelligent maid, she said. I was also a spy. Both things were true. Both things were true, he agreed. And now you are neither, and you are still here, and I find that I am asking myself the question I spent 2 centuries deciding the answer was no to. He looked at her steadily. I am asking it because I think you should be the one who decides whether the question is worth asking at all. You are the one with the shorter arithmetic. You are the one who would have to choose what this costs. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the quiet of her room in the estate, in the hours after their late conversations, in the time she spent working through the archive with a particular kind of focused attention that was her native language and that she had brought to him, to understanding him, as readily as she brought it to everything else. She had thought about what it meant to be human in the world of an immortal, and what it would cost and what it would give. I think, she said carefully, that the arithmetic argument is somewhat disingenuous. He looked at her. You're assuming, see, she said, that the correct comparison is between the length of a mortal life and the length of an immortal life. But that is not actually the comparison. The correct comparison is between a mortal life that contains this, whatever this is, and a mortal life that does not. She looked at him levelly. I was not planning to live forever before I walked into your household. I was planning to live the way humans live, as well as possible, with the people and the work that matter most to me. The only question is whether you are willing to bear the grief of the shorter arithmetic, because the cost of that falls on you, not on me. The silence that followed this was the longest one yet. He looked at her as though she had just said something that reversed the direction of a river he had been watching flow the same way for a very long time. That, he said finally, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a significant number of years. I am a very honest person, she said. It has caused me difficulties throughout my life. It is also, he said, and stood from the chair and came around the table to stand near her, close in the way he had been close in the elder chamber, present and deliberate, and radiating the particular gravity of someone who has made a decision. One of the things I find most extraordinary about you, among several, she looked up at him. The archive was very quiet around them. The ancient records watched from their shelves. Somewhere above them, Vienna went about its ordinary human business, unaware that beneath it, in a room that smelled of old parchment and cold stone, a man who had been alive for 3 centuries was looking at a woman with dark hair and steady eyes, like she was the first genuinely surprising thing he had encountered in 100 years. "Emeric," she said. "Yes." "Ask the question." He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the danger she knew was also part of him. The old violence and the court politics and the 3 centuries of survival at the level of a vampire lord. The gentleness was not a contradiction of those things. It was, she had come to understand, the other side of the same quality. The things he protected completely and without reservation, and the gentleness was part of that. "Will you," he said very quietly, "let this be something between us? Fully and honestly, with all the things it is and all the things it is not." "Yes," she said, "I will." The first time he kissed her was not dramatic. It was not in the elder chamber, and it was not in the grand formal rooms, and it was not accompanied by any particular orchestration of Gothic atmosphere. It was in the archive, among the shelves of misfiled historical records, and the color-coded report she had left on his desk, and the Seraphon correspondence that was going to restructure the power of an immortal court. He kissed her quietly and carefully, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and it was the beginning of something that felt, improbably and completely, like it had been inevitable. The restructuring of the Mordaine court's internal power took 3 months and was, by all accounts, one of the more diplomatically complex events in the court's recent history. Emeric presented the evidences from the archive to the full Elder Council in a formal session, and because Vera had organized it with the precision of someone who had spent a great deal of her adult life understanding how evidence worked and how people tried to discredit it, there was nothing Vasilius or Seraphon could do but accept the findings. Seraphon surrendered the transferred authority. She did it with the controlled grace of someone who had lost a political maneuver she had been running for 30 years, and who was furious about it, and who was also too intelligent to make a scene. Vasilius said nothing during the session. He sat in his throne and watched Emeric lay out the evidence piece by piece, and his amber eyes rested on Vera, where she sat to Emeric's left, not as a servant this time, not as a maid, but as the person who had found and documented and organized the case that dismantled 30 years of financial misdirection, and those amber eyes held something that took her a moment to identify. It was respect, ancient and grudging and almost visibly painful to him, but it was there, at the end of the formal session. When the transfers had been recorded and corrections had been made to the court ledger, and the Elder Council had dispersed in their slow, unhurried way, Vasilius stopped at the door and turned. He looked at Vera for a moment with those old amber eyes. "The Hawthorne girl," he said, "the elder one. The one you asked us to remember, Marin," Vera said. "She found this too," Vasilius said. "The financial irregularity. She had gotten as far as the 1990s correspondence before she was detected." He paused, and something in his ancient face moved through expressions she could not entirely read. "I want you to know that what was done was not done with my approval or my knowledge at the time. The elder who ordered her erasure did not consult the full council. He acted unilaterally, which was itself a blood law violation." He was quiet for a moment. She was a brave girl. She deserved better from this court. Vera held very still. "Yes," she said. "She did." Vasilius inclined his head, with the formal precision of an immortal aristocrat, performing an act he did not have a practice template for. Then he left. She stood in the chamber for a long time after that. Emeric stayed beside her, not speaking, not filling the silence with anything, simply present in the way she had come to understand was his particular form of care. He had learned, or perhaps had always known, that the people worth standing beside often needed you to stand beside them quietly, not loudly, not with intervention, but with the steady certainty of being there. She would have been furious, Vera said eventually. Marin. She would have found the whole thing absolutely unacceptable, and she would have made a great deal of noise about it, and she would have made us both go out and get terrible coffee at 2 a.m, and she would have talked about it for hours. Her voice did not break. She was proud of that. She was very good at making noise when things were unacceptable. "You are very good at making things change," Emeric said, quietly and precisely and in ways that cannot be undone. "You are different from each other in method, but not in spirit." Vera looked at him. That is a very good thing to say. It is an accurate thing. I am not given to saying things I do not mean. I know, she said. That is one of the things I find most extraordinary about you. Among several. He looked at her with that look, the one that still surprised her because she would not have expected 3 centuries of immortal life to leave room for that particular quality of genuine warmth. And he reached over and took her hand in both of his, and she let him. The months that followed became the months she would think about later, as the time when everything settled into what it was going to be. Not the dramatic months, the elder council, the confrontation, the restructuring, the signed acknowledgement. The quiet months, the months of evenings in the archive and early mornings, for her when he was retired to the inner chambers because sunlight was absolute and the estate's protocols around it were deeply serious, and evenings when he emerged and found her at whatever she was working on and sat across from her or beside her and was present. He taught her the court's language of record-keeping, the old Viennese script that the administrative ledgers had been kept in since the 17th century, and she taught him how to use the current generation of encryption software, which he learned with the focused precision of someone who had survived 3 centuries by mastering whatever tools the age provided. He was a faster study than she had expected, which should not have surprised her, and he was patient with the things that were genuinely new to him in a way that was entirely at odds with the image of the cold and regal vampire lord that the court projected, and that he had always allowed it to project. "You are much warmer than you let anyone see," she told him one evening. "I am the lord of a vampire court," he said. "Warmth is not a strategically useful quality to display. And yet here you are," she said, "explaining to me why I need to update my software so the court's security infrastructure does not flag my laptop as a potential breach vector, which is a very warm thing to do. It is a practical thing to do, Emeric. Yes. You brought me soup last week when I had a cold." He was quiet for a moment. "I was concerned. It was soup. There is nothing unusual about soup." "You made it yourself," she said. "I checked with the kitchen. They said you requested the use of the kitchen in the early hours of the morning and sent everyone out. I wanted to ensure the recipe was correct. The kitchen staff have a tendency to make things insufficiently. Emeric." He stopped. He looked at her with the precise expression of a 300-year-old vampire lord who has been caught in an act of genuine tenderness and is experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of not being able to construct a satisfactory defense against it. "I wanted you to feel better," he said, quickly. "The cold was making you tired, and when you are tired, you push past it instead of resting, and I did not want you to be unwell." "I know," she said softly. "I know that." She crossed the room to where he was standing and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the thing between them had long since passed the stage of being carefully unnamed. It was named. They had named it. It existed in the archive and in the kitchen, and in the grand formal rooms, and in the quiet corridor where the portrait of his 19th century friend hung, and where he sometimes stopped to look at it with an expression that was less about grief now, and more about a particular kind of peace. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, cold and precisely structured and entirely his, and he closed his eyes for a moment, the way he sometimes did when she touched him. The way that told her that the control he maintained so completely in public had a cost, and that she was one of the few things he allowed past it. "I love you," she said. She had said it once before, 4 months into the quiet months, in the archive in the early evening, with complete directness and no particular fanfare, because that was how she said things. He had gone very still and looked at her for a long moment, and then said it back with the same quality, like something that had been true for a significant length of time and was only now being given its proper name. "I love you," he said now, and his hand came up to cover hers against his jaw. And he opened his eyes and looked at her with 3 centuries of careful attention, and all the specific quality of attention he had been giving her since she walked into his household in a grey maid's uniform and asked him about a portrait. The question of what came next was one they had discussed. They had discussed it with the same direct honesty they brought to everything, which meant they had discussed the hard parts. The arithmetic, as she had called it. The shorter timeline. He had told her what it had been like with the woman in the portrait. the friendship and the watching and the eventual grief of it, and she had listened without minimizing any of it. She had told him that she was not going to pretend, the cost was not real, and he had told her that he was not going to let the cost prevent him from choosing this, from choosing her, and that he had made that decision with full understanding of what it meant. There are options, he had said during one of those discussions, with the careful honesty of someone raising something that was significant and potentially fraught. I know, she had said, vampires could turn humans. It was not simple and it was not without cost, and it required genuine commitment from both parties and the formal endorsement of the court, which in the current climate of the Mordaine court was. Given recent events, something Emeric had more leverage over than he had previously, but they had both agreed that it was not a decision to be made from fear of the arithmetic. It was a decision, if it was made, that had to come from a place of genuine choice, and that they were not there yet, and that yet was a meaningful word. I am not in a hurry, she had told him. I have things I want to do first. The archive audit is not finished, and I want to write Marin's story. Properly. Not for the court records. For myself, I want to write everything she found, and everything she was trying to do, and what happened to her, and how it was corrected. I want there to be a record that is not in ledger language. Then we will do those things first, he had said simply. The archive audit took 11 more months. By the end of it, Vera had documented 40 years of administrative irregularities, corrected the court's financial records, identified 7 instances of unauthorized use of the court's external influence structures, and produced a set of recommendations for operational reform that Emeric put before the Elder Council in a formal session. Most of the recommendations were adopted. Vasilius argued against 2 of them, and lost both arguments because Vera's documentation was airtight, and the Elder Mortivar, who had become unexpectedly useful as an ally following his act of remorse in the confrontation chamber, supported the record. She wrote Marin's story in the evenings in the room she had made her own in the estate, a room that had windows facing an inner courtyard where no sunlight reached and where she had installed bookshelves and a desk that faced the door. She wrote it carefully and with complete honesty, and she wept during some of it and did not during others, and Emeric read each section as she finished it and did not try to tell her how she was allowed to feel about any of it, which was exactly right. The finished document she placed in the corrected court archive, under Vera Hawthorne's name in the section for human staff of distinction. She also sent a copy to a historian she trusted, with instructions for how it should be held, and when it could eventually be shared. When it was done, she sat in her room for a long time and thought about her sister. She thought about everything Marin had been, and everything she had tried to do, and the courage it had taken to be what she was. She thought about how proud she was of her, and how much she missed her, and how neither of those things was ever going to fully resolve, and how that was right, because some losses were not supposed to resolve, only to find their proper place in the ongoing life of the person who carried them. Emeric found her there as the evening came and sat beside her on the window seat and did not speak for a long time. She would have liked you, Vera said finally. Would she? She would have found you absolutely ridiculous in the first meeting, because of the coat and the general effect of everything. She would have called you dramatic to your face, probably within the first 10 minutes. He was quiet for a moment, and after the first meeting, she would have liked you enormously, Vera said, because she was a very good judge of what mattered, and you matter. Whatever else you are, and however much coat you wear, you matter in the ways that count. He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and outside the courtyard was dark and quiet, and she felt the cold steadiness of him and the particular quality of safety that was not about being shielded from hard things, but about being met by someone in the middle of them. I would like to have known her, he said. I know, she said. Me too. The question of the turning came back to her 6 months after the archive was finished, and it came back not from fear or from pressure, but from something that felt like readiness. She raised it herself, directly, in the archive where most of the significant things between them had first Basin said, and she said it the way she said everything. I have been thinking about the timeline conversation, she said, and I think I am ready to discuss it seriously, not from a place of alarm about the arithmetic, from a place of actually wanting to. She looked at him across the table. I want to stay, not because I am afraid of leaving. Because I have things I want to do that will take longer than a mortal life to do them properly. The court's records go back to the 12th century, and the pre-1400 material has never been properly catalogued. And also, she said, more quietly, I want more time with you, a great deal more time, and I am choosing that clearly, with full information. He was very still for a moment, then he said, Are you certain? I have been certain for some months, she said. I was waiting until I had finished the things I wanted to finish as a human first, the archive, Marin's record, and I wanted to be sure I was not deciding from momentum or from sentiment. I am not. I am deciding from the same place I decided to stand in the elder chamber with the codex and tell Vasilius what the consequences of erasing me would be. From a considered, informed, completely intentional position. Of course you are, he said softly. Is the court's formal endorsement still within your authority to arrange? It is very much within my authority to arrange. Then I would like to arrange it. He stood from his chair and came around the table and stood before her, and she looked up at him with the same steadiness she had brought to every moment since she walked into his household as a woman, with a mission, and left as something else entirely. Something she had not been able to predict or plan for, and would not have traded for anything.
Vera Hawthorne,
he said, and her name in his voice had the same weight it always had. 3 centuries of attention and care, and the specific quality of an immortal who had decided that the shorter arithmetic was a price he would pay for the entirety of her company. You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, possibly ever, and the fact that you are about to argue with me for calling you remarkable is one of the many reasons why. I was not going to argue with you, she said. I was going to say that you are not without your own considerable qualities. Which are? You are deeply honest, she said. You are protective without being controlling, which is rarer than it should be. You make very good soup. You read everything I write, and you understand what I am trying to say, and you respond to what I actually wrote, not to what you expected to find. And you came through those doors, she said, the way you always come through doors, like the room was waiting for you, and you stood beside me. He cupped her face in both hands, carefully, like she was something he had been trusted with, and intended to honor that trust absolutely. I will always stand beside you, he said. I know, she said. That is why I am here. He kissed her then in the archive, among the properly catalogued records and the color-coded systems she had built, and the place where Marin's story was now properly and permanently kept. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. The formal process of the turning was undertaken with the full endorsement of the Elder Council, presented and voted on in a session that was notably brief compared to most of the sessions Vera had attended or heard accounts of. Even Vasilius voted yes, with the precise, efficient gesture of someone who had recalibrated their position on a matter and was not going to waste further time on ceremony about it. Seraphon was the last to vote, and she looked at Vera for a moment with those pale violet eyes before casting her agreement, and what was in those ancient eyes was something Vera catalogued and kept. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement, from one person of significant capability to another, that the other was exactly what they appeared to be. The process itself was Emeric's domain entirely, conducted with the gravity and care that all the court protocols required. She had read about it, of course, because she read about everything, and knowing the procedural outline of something and experiencing it were 2 different countries entirely. What she remembered most afterward was the way he held her hand through the worst of it, and the way he said her name quietly and steadily in the dark like a point of navigation, and the way she came through to the other side of it and opened her eyes to a world that was the same world, and also entirely changed. She saw everything with new precision. The silver flames of the estate's chandeliers were not white, as she had always seen them. They were 1,000 discrete shades of cold color. The old parchment of the archive records contained depths of texture she had never been able to read before, and Emeric, standing before her in the room where she had woken to the new shape of her life, looked at her with silver eyes and the expression of someone who had been holding his breath through something consequential and could now breathe. She looked at her hands, white now like his, like all of them. the aristocratic pallor of the court which had always seemed to her like an aesthetic choice and turned out to be simply a fact. "How do you feel?" he asked. She took stock carefully, in the methodical way that was her nature and that was apparently unalterable by transformation. "Strange," she said. "Precise. Very awake." She looked up at him. The portrait in the south corridor. The woman with the garden. I could see the brushwork, the individual strokes. I could see how old the paint was. "Yes," he said. "You will find the archive illuminating in several new ways." "I expect I will find everything illuminating in several new ways," she said. "I have approximately 3 centuries of illumination ahead of me, assuming we manage the court politics competently." "We will manage them," he said, with the quiet certainty that was simply his register for everything he had decided. "Emeric," she said. "Yes, the pre-1400 material. You said it had never been properly catalogued. It has not." "That is going to take a great deal of time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is good," she said. He smiled, both sides, the way he smiled in the archive and the kitchen and the south corridor and nowhere else. The smile that was hers, that had been hers from the 5th conversation and the question about the portrait, and that she was going to be on the receiving end of for a very long time. The court of House Mordaine settled into its new shape over the following years. The reforms held. The financial restructuring proved as significant as Emeric had suspected, and the additional authority he recovered gave him the standing to push through changes in the court's external protocols that had needed changing since the 1970s. The human staff turnover decreased. The culture of the estate shifted in ways that were subtle, and then, over time, not subtle at all, Vasilius did not become a friend. He was not built for friendship, but he became something that functioned effectively enough, an opponent who had recognized the value of the current arrangement and was operating within it with the pragmatic intelligence that had kept him alive for centuries. He and Vera had 3 conversations in the first year that were entirely adversarial, 2 in the second year that were approximately half adversarial, and by the 5th year they had achieved a functional working relationship based on mutual respect for the other's capabilities and a shared understanding that the stability of the court was better served by coordination than by continued conflict. She documented all of it. The court's living record was her domain, properly organized and cross-referenced and maintained with the obsessive precision that was her primary characteristic and that had been, from the beginning, one of the things Emeric had found most compelling about her. The pre-1400 materials proved exactly as rewarding as she had hoped. There were discoveries in those ancient records that changed the court's understanding of its own history, and she wrote those discoveries up with the same care she had brought to everything, and the court historians, a small and initially skeptical group of elder vampires, became over time some of her most engaged colleagues. She became herself within the new shape of her life, not a transformed version that bore only surface resemblance to who she had been, but herself carried forward into expanded capability and extended time. She kept Marin's story in the archive, and she visited it sometimes, not with grief as the primary register, but with the quality of remembering someone who had mattered deeply and whose impact was legible in the world, in ways that were permanent. She and Emeric built a life that was genuinely theirs in the way that lives become genuinely yours when you have fought for them, when you have walked into the places that required courage and said the true things and stood beside the right people and did not flinch from the cost of any of it. Their evenings in the archive continued, because some habits are too good to outgrow. Their conversations ranged across everything the world contained, and then some, because he had 3 centuries of experience, and she had the archive, and between them there was always more to say. He was protective still, always, in the way that was his fundamental nature, the careful attention and the instinct to stand between her and harm. And she had learned to accept that not as constraint but as the specific form of his love, the way his caring translated into action in the world. She was strong enough that his protection never diminished her, and he was perceptive enough to know that and to calibrate accordingly. So what they had was not one person sheltering another from the weather, but 2 people who had decided the world was better faced together. There was an evening, many years later, when they stood together in the south corridor before the portrait of the woman in the garden. The woman who had first taught him that mortal lives were not lesser for being brief. Vera stood beside him and looked at the painting with her new precision of sight, reading the age in the paint, the individual decisions of the artist, the exact expression on the painted face. She would have liked this, Vera said.
The new version of things.
Yes, Emeric said. She would. The court treating humans as people with standing, the archive being properly organized, the soup. She was very clear about soup, he said. She had strong opinions. As she should have, Vera said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the familiar cold steadiness of him, and outside, above them, Vienna went about its ordinary business, and below it, in the estate that was theirs now in every sense that mattered, the silver flames burned without flickering, and the ancient records sat in their proper order, and the world was very wide and very strange and entirely worth inhabiting. "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him. "For what?" "For coming in that door," he said. 3 months in a grey uniform, with a mission that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with someone you loved. For asking the right questions. For standing in that chamber and refusing to be erased. He looked at her with those silver eyes, unchanged, as they would remain unchanged, as she had chosen they would remain. "For choosing to stay. I did not stay for you," she said. "At first, I know, but then I did. I know that too," he said. She kissed him there in the south corridor, in front of the portrait of a woman in a garden who had spent her mortal life in the company of an immortal, and had understood something important about that. Something that Vera now understood too from the inside. That it was not about the arithmetic in the end. That it was about what you built with the time you had, and whether you built it with someone who deserved the weight you gave them, and whether you were honest about all of it. The cost and the beauty and the hard parts and the good ones. They had been honest about all of it. They were still being honest about all of it. And the court, which had assumed she had no power there, which had prepared to erase her from its records like a pencil mark on parchment, had discovered what happened when a woman with complete clarity of purpose and the right kind of preparation walked into the most dangerous room in the world and refused to disappear. It had discovered what she and Emeric had known, in their different ways, from the beginning. That the most powerful thing in any room, ancient or modern, Gothic or otherwise, is not the creature with the longest history or the highest throne or the oldest blood. It is the person who knows exactly what they are fighting for and refuses to stop.